In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Veni Sancte Spiritus, repletuorum codifiterium, et tui amoris in eis, in imacende, emite Spiritum tuum creabuntur,
et renovabis facium terrae.
Oremus, Deus codifiterium, Sancti Spiritus, illustration doco Christi, da nobis in edam Spiritu recta sapere, et Deus immergatus regaudere, per Christum Dominum nostrum,
Amen.
cor Maria Immaculatum,
Ora pro nobis.
Sancta Ioannes,
Ora pro nobis.
Santa Maria Magdalena,
Ora pro nobis.
in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So today is one of those great feasts, St. John before the Latin gate, where he was to be boiled in oil and come out like a French fry. But he came out stronger than before. I gotta move this, switch this chair. This thing is loud. These old chairs. All right. So I've been to that church where this happened in Rome. And it's one of those feasts that the new 62 removed for a reason. You know, why would Bonini remove this feast? One, it's a miracle. They don't like miracles. And two, they call it all legend. It's not based on historic facts, they say. So, all their hogwash. All right, let's look at chapter 1, page 84, Apologetics, historical authority of the four Gospels. How do you know the actual authors actually wrote the Gospels? It's a dumb question, but with scoffers and heretics, you have to defend the Gospels. Status questionis, the state of the question, Anthony.
We must now establish the Gospels, being the main source of the life of Christ, as historical books and not as inspired books. As such, historical science can only give us a moral certainty and not metaphysical, but this suffices.
So moral certainty suffices. It's morally certain the Civil War took place because witnesses were there, photographs were taken, you can go to the battlefields. Were we there to see it and measure it and film it? No, but it's a moral certainty. So with moral certainty, it suffices. It's enough. The Gospels say 2 witnesses are enough to establish a truth. 2 witnesses testifying to something. We must establish 3 things for the reliability of any historical source. 1, Anthony?
Whether it is genuine or authentic, that is it written by those authors to whom it is attributed?
So did St. Matthew write St. Matthew's Gospel? Did St. John write his Gospel? 2.
Whether it is integral, that is not adulterated by those following?
Yeah, so not tampered with. Integral means has all its parts. I have written here the example of, I think it's 1 John 5:7, and these 3 are one. I forget what this was referring to, but anyway.
That's probably referring to, because there's a claim that particular verse is a variation. It's not in some of the Greek manuscripts, but it's in most of the Greek manuscripts. So that's just
I see. Okay. 3.
Whether it is historically truthful, or if it has veracity with regard to the narration of facts, namely, whether or not the evangelists were deceived or were themselves deceivers.
These points can be proved either by A, B, C, extrinsic arguments, B, intrinsic arguments, and C, dealing with rationalists and modernists. So, extrinsic arguments, go on.
extrinsic arguments which can give historical certitude to the authenticity of some book, provided that the witnesses cited are suitable and that their testimony has not been adulterated.
Yes, so we will see that, such as Tacitus, who was not a Catholic, but he refers to the Gospels. He refers to Christ. And some other, Josephus, of course, as well, the historian. B, intrinsic arguments.
Sometimes show that such an author could not have written this book, for example, because this manner of writing pertains to a later age. These internal marks do not suffice to positively determine the author and exact time of composition of some book, but only give a probability, and so are only confirmations of external proof.
True. C.
Rationalists and modernists exaggerate the value of the internal method, having a priori judgment.
Having a priori
judgments. For example, miracles are not possible, and at the same time despise external arguments. Yet in using internal arguments alone, many want to arrive at the greatest scientific knowledge through a way that can only give probability. Therefore, this way of quote-unquote higher criticism is a defect of criticism.
Yes, good point. Authenticity or genuineness of the Gospels. Read on, brother.
A document is authentic or genuine when it is written by the author whose name it bears in the strict sense. In the broad sense, a document is genuine if it can be traced to the period of history contemporaneous with or immediately following the events it records, or when written at the time assigned to it.
External evidence. Indirect testimony. A, from tradition. Read on, brother.
The universal church tradition shows that the views of the many is in fact an expression of the universal belief of the church, since many dioceses were relatively independent, yet all accepted the Gospels as genuine and distinguished them from
apocryphal
writings, such as a universal belief could not be in error, and points to a genuine fact.
2.
This universal belief appeals to apostolic tradition for the origin of the Gospels.
Yeah, so everyone just accepts it as the apostles wrote it because they wrote it. There was never attacked or questioned. Origen, who was one of the church fathers, born in 185, so he's early. He is quoted by many saints in St. Thomas. He was never canonized as saint for various reasons. And he, for example, Origen, I think it's him that held that hell would freeze over someday, that Lucifer and the devils would be forgiven and they'd be admitted into heaven. But that error was condemned. All right, so what did he say, Origen?
I have learned from tradition that the four Gospels recognized without contradiction by the whole Church of God throughout the world were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah, so that's a heavy authority, right? Very early, backing the Gospels. Author of the Oratorian fragment from the 2nd century says,
no writing, however old and venerable it may be considered as sacred or canonical, unless it is proven to be apostolic.
That means coming from the time of the apostles. Yes. So those are very, very early quotes. 3.
such strict measures were used and maintained an apostolic tradition, that fraud is inconceivable.
Yes, fraud was inconceivable. So the strict measures surrounding, the preciousness of the Gospels. So we have, going back to 84, page 84, we must establish three things for the reliability of any historical source. It is genuine or authentic. Those are the real authors. 2, it's integral, not adulterated. 3, it's historically truthful. So this is what we're trying to prove right now. Origin of writings in their own hand and signed. 1 Corinthians 16:21, the salutations of me, Paul, with my own hand. 1 Corinthians 16:21. Do you have your scriptures? Look at all these quotes here. Colossians 4:8. Why don't you look that up? All of you find your scriptures. And look up Colossians 4:8, Anthony. St. Paul's letter to the Colossians.
There's a Bible right here.
Colossians 4:8. Brother, you look up Galatians 6, chapter 6, verse 11. Galatians. St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 6, verse 11.
I have Colossians 4, verse 8.
Okay.
It says, "What I have sent to you for this same purpose, that he may know the things that concern you and comfort your hearts. With Onesimus, a most beloved and faithful brother, who is one of you, all things that are done here, they shall make known to you."
All right, so it's very personal. He's writing, he's referring to people he knows in Colossia. Look up 2 Thessalonians 3:17, Anthony.
I have Galatians 6:11 if you want me to read that.
Okay, brother, look up 2 Thessalonians 3:17. Go ahead.
"See what a letter I have written to you with my own hand." That's Galatians.
Yeah, so this is just showing St. Paul wrote his epistles, and he's saying it with my own hand. 2 Thessalonians 3:17. Oh, brother, that's at the end of the New Testament.
Very back.
Yes. 2 Thessalonians 3:17. Next point. Writers took pains to preserve intact the written and oral teaching. Galatians 1:7. Anthony?
I have it. I'll go for the verse before because it sets up. "I wonder that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel." Here's 7. "Which is not another, only there are some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ."
Okay. So mainly the Jews who were trying to pervert the Gospels and give a different message. So St. Paul is admitting that fact. So if it's attacked, they have to protect it. Right? Brother, did you find 2 Thessalonians 3:17?
I haven't found Thessalonians yet.
Okay. Gabriel, 2 Thessalonians.
The salutation of Paul with my own hand, which is the sign in every epistle. So I write.
So he's admitting, I wrote these epistles. It's with my own hand. And 2 Thessalonians, I think it's 2:15 there.
It's to 2 Thessalonians 2:15.
2 Thessalonians 2:15. Does anyone have it?
I have it. "Now our Lord Jesus Christ himself and God and our Father, who has loved us and have given us everlasting consolation and good hope in grace."
Okay, so it must be a different chapter. Verse 2 and 15. Oh, well. Okay, so all these quotes were just showing what?
It was showing the internal evidence that Paul is the writer.
Yes, Paul wrote his own epistles. And he also admits the Gospels were attacked and we have to protect them. Okay, succeeding generations would accept as original only what had the attestation of those who had received them from the apostles and their successors and disciples, while preserving the ancient texts as long as possible. Tertullian, who's another heavy-hitting authority, he's one of the church fathers, like Origen, but he, like Origen, was not canonized. I think because Tertullian, later in his life he fell into some heresy or error, so he was never canonized. Read the quote of Tertullian there, Gabriel.
Quote, "Go through the apostolic churches in which the professional chairs of the apostles still stand, wherein their authentic writings themselves are still read." Unquote.
So he refers to it as authentic writings, meaning,
They were genuine.
yeah, so who wrote St. Matthew's Gospel?
St. Matthew.
Who wrote St. Mark's?
St. Mark.
I mean, it's a dumb, it's kind of silly we have to prove this, but you have to with the scoffers you're dealing with. The sacred books, read on.
The sacred books were subject to the guardianship of the bishops and clergy,
Louder.
as well as the faithful, the latter also being very familiar with the scriptures. St. Augustine recording the protest of one church to the translating of ivy for the gourd in the story of Jonas.
Yes, so I guess St. Augustine had to deal with protests because somebody translated the word ivy. Remember after he got spat up by the whale, Jonas was on the beach, exhausted, and an ivy grew up to give him some shade. So
This was St. Jerome. St. Jerome changed the word gourd from ivy because he was telling St. Augustine that in translating from the original language, it was hard to find an exact word for gourd. So he used a word that was closest to that.
and what exactly is a gourd?
I'm pretty sure it's a type of fruit
Let's look it up.
or vegetable.
Gourd. Gourds are a diverse group of fruits from the squash family, including edible varieties like bottle gourd, lauki, bitter gourd, karela, and ridge gourd, lufa, as well as hard-shelled ornamental types. Edible gourds are used in many cuisines, particularly in South Asia, for dishes like curries, stir-fries, and stews, offering a mild flavor and tender texture when cooked. It's crucial to distinguish edible gourds from ornamental ones, which are not for consumption. Okay, yeah, so you're saying that St. Jerome, who had no other word to translate it, and people were in an uproar that he loosely translated one word.
Yeah, and Jerome makes the point that when translating from one language to another, if you're going to translate it literally, sometimes it obscures the sense. So he found it better to just use a word that meant plant rather than this specific word
Yes.
for gourd.
Yeah, everyone follow that? Interesting. But the point is made. The point is made in this debate. What's the point?
That that even the faithful, they knew. Because right here was saying that the faithful, the latter being also familiar with the scriptures. That's why this was brought up. The faithful.
And the point is
that
what's the purpose of this whole argument here?
the origins of the writings, to prove that the early Christians did read the scriptures that were written by the apostles.
Or if they didn't read them, they heard them. Most likely they heard them being read. There was no printing press,
That's true.
right? So nobody owned the Bible. It's impossible.
And yet they were still so familiar with the scriptures that even one little change in the word caused an uproar.
Yes. And we have to remember, these people were trained in memorization. From their childhood, their schooling was all memorization. So much so that it's Socrates who said, you shouldn't take notes. Notes is a corruption. He considered it a corruption, taking notes. So, of course, most of us would be lost without notes. But it just shows, just one word here, and there was an uproar. And it's the same with the canon of the Mass. St. Gregory the Great, he put in, after St. Michael delivered Rome from this terrible plague, he put in a little bit, just one to 4 or 5 words in the Ankicitur, which we still say today. In diesque pace in diesque nostros, something like that, granting peace in our days. He put those 3 or 4 or 5 words in the Ankicitur, and there was a whole crowd in front of the Lateran Basilica. What are you doing to our canon of the Mass? Why are you putting words in? Why are you changing our canon? And St. Gregory says, okay, well, cool down. I'm just putting it in because... But that's early, right? That's 500-600s.
Yeah, it shows that they were very careful in the preservation of the scriptures.
Scriptures and the Mass and the sacred liturgy, yeah. And nothing compared to the reckless and sacrilegious destruction of our liturgy under the liturgical commission, headed by who?
Bugnini.
Yes. B, tradition, in particular. So, let's see here. A was indirect testimony from tradition, indirect testimony. We're looking at B, tradition in particular. First, so now we're getting into the concrete evidence here. 1st century. 1, the Didache. 2, the letter of Barnabas. 3, St. Clement of Rome, who was Pope from 92 to 101. 1, the Didache, or the teaching of the 12 apostles. Anthony?
Written between 70 and 90 AD, quotes only the first 3 Gospels, saying, "Thus you find it stated in the Gospel of the Lord," end quote. The Gospels are taken for granted as well known.
Yes, so the Didache was it's a reliable source. Let me see what... The Didache, also known as the Lord's teaching through the 12 apostles to the nations, is a brief anonymous early Christian treatise written in Koine Greek, dated by modern scholars at the 1st or 2nd century. And the Didache was not included in the Bible primarily because it failed to meet the strict early church criteria for scriptural canon, specifically lacking direct apostolic authorship. While highly regarded as an early instruction manual or catechism, it was deemed in the view of some early church fathers, like Eusebius, as not inspired in the same manner as the New Testament books. So isn't that interesting, that fact? The Didache you would expect would be in the Gospels, but it's not, because it didn't meet the standards, which shows they weren't just flippant about all this. 2, the letter of Barnabas from 96 to 98. And 3, Anthony?
Clement of Rome, Pope from 92 to 101, in his epistle to the Corinthians, have extracts from the synoptics.
So what's the synoptics?
The synoptics are Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Yes, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptics, excluding St. John. 2nd century. 1, Anthony?
Saint Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch.
St. Ignatius.
Saint Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch.
And he's martyred at about 107 AD.
Wrote 7 epistles on his way to Rome, quoting the synoptics freely and especially St. John's Gospel.
So he's quoting the 4 Gospels. St. Ignatius, and that's early, 107. So in the late 90s, he's quoting the Gospels, right? 2. St. Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, martyred what year?
156.
Go on.
Is a friend of Ignatius and disciple of St. John the Apostle, the teacher of St. Irenaeus, who has recorded his association with St. John and his preaching, which, quote, was all in perfect agreement with the Holy Scriptures, end quote.
What does that tell you?
It tells you that St. John perfectly passed down what he was told by Christ.
Yes. And do you think many Protestants are aware of St. Polycarp?
No.
But if they were, what would they discover?
Tradition.
And that he actually personally knew.
St. John.
He knew him personally. And he was martyred for the same faith. And in his other letters, you find reference to the primacy of Peter, the 7 sacraments, veneration of the Virgin Mary, right? All the Catholic beliefs are contained in these letters. That's why it's so important, this part of tradition.
And St. Ignatius, who knew Polycarp, who knew St. John, talks about the whole Eucharist. St. Ignatius.
That's right. Yeah, we looked at his life and history. Yes. And he talks about also the bishop being in union with the bishop under the Pope. So you have the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church. It's not just these strange denominations scattered everywhere, as with the Protestants, right? There is a hierarchy and obedience. And of course, bishops who were hound dogs to protect the faith, like good shepherds. 3, Papias, Papias, Bishop of Hierapolis in Phrygia. Go on. He was a
pupil of St. John, a friend of Polycarp, and the first to give direct testimony of the human authors of the Gospels, as recorded by Eusebius's ecclesiastical history, and the Adversus Heresis of Irenaeus.
Of St. Irenaeus, yes. So here's another one, Papias, who knew St. John, very probably even consecrated a bishop by him. That would be an interesting detail to look up. And here is Papias. No, this is from ecclesiastical history, this quote, written by Eusebius, Bishop Eusebius. Read it.
Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote exactly all that Christ had said and done, so far as he recollected it. Matthew, on the contrary, wrote down the utterances of Jesus in the Hebrew tongue, and on this account everyone translated them as best he could.
Okay, so you have 2 Gospels referred to here, Matthew and St. Mark. So just the fact that they're talking about them and quoting them and treating them with reverence already is a huge backing of their authenticity. Number 4, Aristides, who was, brother?
A Greek philosopher, wrote in defense of the Christians.
Circa, around the year
140, saying that all this can be learned from the book of...
Quote from... All this can be learned, quote, go on.
Quote, from the book of the Christians and the writings, end quote, of the New Testament.
Okay, well, he forgot to put the close quotes. From the book of the Christians and the writings of the New Testament. So that's another early Greek philosopher defending the Christians. He's outside he's not an apostle, he's not a disciple, but he's just an outsider referring to the New Testament writings. 5, brothers.
Saint Justin, martyr.
Circa, around what year?
165. Wrote several defenses drawn from the, quote, memories of the apostles. Memoirs of the apostles, called Gospels, end quote. Composed by the apostles and disciples of Christ.
Yes. So again, St. Justin is referring to the Gospels. They're authentic, they're real, they're not just made up. 6. Moratorian fragment. Gabriel?
So called because it was found in 1740 by a scholar named Oratory in the Ambrosiana in Milan, which is an early canon or catalog of the sacred writings, which dates from about 170. Which, though incomplete, witnesses to the existence of only 4 Gospels. Quote, in the third place, the book of the Gospel according to Luke, and, quote, the fourth of the Gospels of John, of the number of the true disciples, end quote.
Okay, of the disciples, yes. All right. So these are just all proofs showing early quotes referring to the Gospels, that they're authentic. 7. Saint Irenaeus, who died 202, he was Bishop of Lyon in France. Go on.
Saint Irenaeus wrote the Adversus Hereses
Between
174 and 189. It's an important witness of the early church, being acquainted with the universal church, born in Asia Minor, lived in Rome, and bishop in Gaul. His immediate successor in Lyon was Pontinus, born in the 1st century. He knew St. Polycarp, the disciple of St. John, is called by Tertullian, quote, omnium doctrinarum curiosissimus explorator.
which means a most curious explorer of all doctrines. So he's called by Tertullian. Tertullian calls St. Irenaeus a most curious explorer of all doctrines, and
quotes the Gospels numerous times, as well as the fact of their authorship from Adversus
Hereses
Hereses,
3:1:1. Go on.
while at the same time defending the unwritten Gospel tradition. Quote, and even if the apostles had left us no writings, would not we have been obliged to hold the guiding line of the traditions, which they bequeathed to those to whom they entrusted the churches.
Okay, can you read that again?
And even if the apostles had left us no writings, would not we have been obliged to hold to the guiding line of the traditions, which they bequeathed to those to whom they entrusted the churches?
Yes, you already see the respect and the great veneration for tradition. Is this our delivery? Brother, go ahead and tell them they can deliver it right here in front of the door. Just tell them. That's the 15 drywall sheets. Okay, so that's 1st century, 2nd century, now the 3rd century. Any comments on so far?
I was just going to say that's a heavy authority early, showing that it's not just that kind of refutes sola scriptura right there. Because he's even saying, even if we have no writings from the apostles, we still have a duty as Christians to hold to tradition.
Yes, good point. Traditions, yes. Yes. All right, now to 3rd century. Number 8. St. Clement of Alexandria, born around 150, and Tertullian, born around 160 AD. Read on, Anthony.
Take us to the 3rd century, where the number of witnesses is beyond cataloging. These 2 writers in Africa quote the Gospels numerous times and show that they were in possession of them in a complete and precise form.
So they actually had the Gospels. How would they have had the Gospels? Why? Because in Clement of Alexandria was a huge library, a real center for learning. And it was St. Mark, the apostle, who brought the faith there. So Alexandria was famous for its library. And if I remember correctly, and I stand to be corrected, when the Muslims invaded, they burnt this whole library down to the ground. So that's the barbarian Muslims. 87. B. Evidence from outside the church. Page 87. And outside the church. So this is also a strong authority because they're not even Catholics and they're referring to the Gospels. So you have 1. Marcion, 2. Basilides, 3. Valentinus, 4. Tatian, 5. Celsus. And then note the Apocrypha. So this is still external evidence, but from outside the church. So first, Marcion. Anthony?
In early 2nd century, became a Manichaean, accepting the 4 Gospels as authentic, although considering 3 of them inferior revelation to his own revised Gospel of Luke.
Yeah, so being a heretical Manichaean, it looks like they tampered with the Gospels to fit their heresies. But he refers to the Gospels, right? And Marcion, he's going to meet St. Ignatius of Antioch in Rome. And Ignatius is going to say, Marcion is going to say, don't you recognize me? And what's St. Ignatius going to tell him?
He's going to say, yes, I know you. You are a son of the devil.
Yes, you are a son of the devil. Yes, or a spawn of Satan, something like that. So, 2, Basilides. Anthony?
Who wrote 24 books of commentary on the Gospels and adds a 5th Gospel of Matthias to substantiate his Gnostic errors.
So, yes. Do we have a Gospel of Matthias?
No.
No, that would be, if there is, it would be labeled under the
non-canonical. Well,
the non-canonical books called the
Apocrypha.
Apocrypha. Yeah. 3, Valentinus. Anthony?
Also Gnostic, interprets all the Gospels allegorically, died about 160.
But he takes the Gospels and writes on it. That's the point. They're referring to the pillar of the Gospels. 4, Tatian, who was
A student of Justin Martyr, composed a Diatessaron between 172 and 180, or the Gospel of the Four, a harmony of the Gospels, although founded the sect of the Encratites. The Codex Cyrus Sinaiticus, found in 1892 in the monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai, dating from the 400s, is a translation of adaptation of Tatian's work.
yes.
Would we be able to just bring it straight up? Because they're just carrying each one over at a time.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll stop there. We're almost done with class. Anyway, so we'll stop right here. Let's bring in the drywall. Agitorium nostrum in nomine Domini.